My grandfather was an engineer turned publisher. So he was what you could call a self-made man. He became very wealthy, and he published a local paper in Spandau, part of Berlin. It was called Spandauer Zeitung. My grandmother came from a Jewish family, but what people often forget is that, say, middle-class Jewish families in Germany, on the whole, were almost totally assimilated. They'd often been already christened in the 19th century. Well, all the ones I know of, or I knew, with very few exceptions, were not religious. But they were only defined as a Jewish race by the Nazis. My grandmother didn't understand herself as non-German or anything like that. She couldn't understand this whole idea. She was, by the way, a very successful opera singer at the Berlin State Opera unter den Linden, where she finished a very promising career when she married and became pregnant. As I said, my grandmother didn't define herself as a Jew, and she shared that with a lot of people. There were quite a lot of Jews. I just mentioned one famous name, Victor Klemperer, who wrote the famous diaries, who felt very patriotic and felt very German. Lots of them fought in the First World War. So there was this kind of thinking was prevalent, especially in the middle class. And when the time came, when things became dangerous for my grandmother, she simply didn't understand it. She absolutely refused to leave the country, which my father originally had planned, because he was a very political person, and he very early on realized what the rise of the Nazis meant for Germany, and he foresaw a lot of things. I remember he told me once about his aunt, the sister of his mother, Tante Muschi. He actually went down on his knees and begged her to get out of the country. That's how he described it to me. And she laughed at him. She said, "You're crazy." And she actually died in a concentration camp later. There are a lot of examples of this kind of thing, where people actually also left it much too late, because there was a time when people couldn't get out anymore. And people who left very early on and who were did very careful planning could sometimes save some of their possessions and particularly their money by opening accounts in Switzerland and things like that. Later on, this all became much more, and by the time the war came, I think you could forget about all that. So, as I say, my father sensed the danger very early, and it unfortunately all turned out to be as he had foreseen. By the way, by that time, he fell under the Nuremberg laws that forbade people like publishers or professions like that, journalists or whatever, to be half Jews. That wasn't possible anymore. For some reasons that I cannot explain, he kept in possession of the newspaper in Spandau, but somebody had, an Aryan person had to be put in there as a manager. So he bought this house in Babelsberg, and then when the war actually started, he sent us children to Austria. I can't quite explain why. Somehow he felt the children must get out of here, but in 1938, Austria was already part of the Nazi Reich, so I don't know what, maybe he was afraid that bombs would fall early or something like that. I can't explain it, but he sent us, we spent about almost a year in the Austrian Alps with our nanny. And in the meantime, he went to the south of Germany and he rented a house in the Black Forest in a tiny little village, not far from the Swiss border. And that was not by accident, but that was a route that one could possibly have taken if the worst came to the worst. You couldn't probably quite walk to the Swiss border, or would have taken you some time, but say you could bicycle it in a couple of hours or so. So that he must have thought this through quite carefully after he had given up on the notion of me being able to leave the country, because his mother was not to be moved. There were other reasons, family reasons, why it was very difficult for him to leave, but I won't get into all the details now. As I say, after she had resisted every wish from my father's side to get out of the country, and it was by then our getting too late anyway. And I remember my mother told me that she had already actually gotten her papers that meant to be sent to Theresienstadt, which was one of the concentration camps. I think my grandmother still didn't quite understand what was happening to her. It wasn't that she was stupid. As I said, she shared this with very many people, and I think she just didn't want to believe that something like that could happen to her. She felt she'd had a very successful career. She was somebody. And I don't know how she looked at these papers, but obviously she still didn't realize how close the danger was. Yeah, my grandmother probably felt as German as anybody else, if not more so. And she felt she was a very successful example as I think she even got some particular praise or something like that, I don't know, or award for her career as a young opera singer. And she knew a lot of famous musicians, and she had sung under famous conductors. And I mean, the state opera was not some second-class kind of house. It was one of the first opera houses. And I think it was that pride and probably just not being able to believe in the unbelievable. So it was a kind of denial that went on there. My father, on the other hand, was very aware that danger was really there. And he had already, like most people in his kind of situation, there were quite a lot of them, he had already put out a lot of feelers, and all these people had a lot of contacts. There was a whole network amongst half-Jews that gave each other tips who could be bribed and stuff like that. All kinds of ways to get out of all the dangers and difficulties that were ahead. His lawyer was also a friend of his, a man called Carl Langbehn. He was later executed after the 20th July as part of the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. This man had a tremendous amount of contacts, and on all sides. That was another thing that is part of the grey zone that existed at that time, that many people don't realize, is that if you wanted to help people, you had to know people on the Nazi side as well. And it had to be the right ones. Say, if you were a lawyer and you wanted to get something out of trouble, you had to play this game a bit as well. That is something that I'm saying now with hindsight, but I think it was very much like that. And Langbehn was a case in hand. He was a lawyer. He helped a lot of people. He found out that there was a doctor who worked for Himmler, and that man took bribes on a fairly high level. I mean, he didn't take a few marks, he took quite a few. Strangely enough, my mother, who wasn't Jewish, went to see this man, this doctor, Dutchman, who she told me when she talked to him that in the beginning he said to her, well, why do you want to do this? You should be glad to get rid of this Jewish grandmother. And, or it would be Jewish mother-in-law in this case. And he was pretty scandalized by that way of putting it. Anyways, she negotiated with him, and in the end, I suppose with the assistance of the lawyer, and in the end he agreed to do something for her for the price of 100,000 Reichsmark. I can't convert this now, I can't tell you, but it was a lot. For this, my grandmother, and I've never actually heard of another case quite like that, but I'm sure there were more, was put into a kind of sanatorium. It is a kind of rest home. As far as I know, she could occasionally receive visitors. She could also occasionally receive letters. I don't think she had contact with my father, because that would probably have been endangering the situation. As far as I know, she was fed properly, and it was a kind of humane incarceration. By the way, that doctor, whose name I forget, I'm afraid, went after the war back to Holland and was for a while celebrated there as a kind of Jew-saving hero, until people who had bribed him, amongst them my father, by the way, made it clear that he was a good businessman, but not so much of a hero.